In terms of trying to sort of light a fire under the CD in Geneva. Do you, anybody here? He has said that it's important to urge that the Conference on Disarmament take up a serious project on nuclear disarmament.
Yes.
And I believe the decision will be made by the Canadian Foreign Affairs whether or not to endorse that, whether to go for that. And that decision will be made on Monday. So it would be, the person who wrote me is urging as many people as possible to write letters to John Baird, our foreign minister, and urge him to vote. Apparently they have not decided how Canada's going to vote on this thing. And I'm sorry that I did not bring the letter with all the details. So if you write a letter, you'll have to be very vague about what you're asking for, because I can't tell you much more than that.
Well,
anyway.
We could ask the office to have that thing available, the Science for Peace office.
Okay.
I have it
Brian,
in mind.
maybe we could put, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send it to Brian. You'll be here tomorrow, and you could put it on our website?
Yeah.
Okay.
The proposal is identical to one of the main recommendations of the Pugwash workshop in August of this
Oh,
year.
good.
The one in Nova Scotia. I was very interested to see it's absolutely identical.
Okay, well, that's good news. So if you check sometime tomorrow, late in the afternoon, let's say, Brian will have up this information that you need in order to write a coherent letter to John Baird, which I think there's a good chance that we might be able to push them to do the right thing. Anyway, our speaker is John Hannigan, a colleague of mine in sociology, and he and I came to Toronto about the same time. I came in '71, you were
76.
Yeah, okay. But we were overlapping long time without really getting acquainted. And I was in Mississauga mostly, and he was in Scarborough, so that probably accounts for some
Oh,
of it.
well. Things end happily, right?
That's right. He has a brand new book out, just came out a few days ago. And I called the bookstore, and they have brought a couple of copies here, but you can examine it, and if you find it as interesting, as I expect you will, you can order it. They will have forms, and we'll have it, they will give you a discount and have it sent to your home. So it is, the title of the book is the same as the title of this lecture, Disasters Without Borders. Something about what's the subtitle?
International politics and natural disasters.
All right, good. Now, John Hannigan is a man of many interests. I guess the main orientation is you're an environmental sociologist.
Well, I wear two hats. One of them is as an environmental sociologist, and the other is as an urban sociologist.
Yeah. And some of the articles and books that I read sounded fascinating, referring to fantasy. What's the title of one of your books? What was it? Fantasy City?
Fantasy City, right?
Yeah.
It's all about the entertainment economy. And,
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Believe me, if you read Fantasy City, you will react in horror at the plans to build a casino in Toronto.
Okay.
You do that already?
Yeah.
I think it comes to.
Believe me,
That's where our
there's
disposition.
no basis for building casinos at all. And all the studies that have been done have basically said no. But of course, politics being politics.
Okay. Well, there's another letter you all write. And you have something called Creative Cities and something called Global Entertainment Economy. That must be a paper, isn't it?
Yeah, the various chapters and things like that.
So, very interesting topic. So, anyway, let's hear from John Hannigan. Here we have some latecomers. Come on in and have a seat.
How you doing, Al? Well, thank you all very much for coming out on somewhat of an unpleasant night, weather-wise. several people have said to me, this is really the week to be doing a talk on disasters. No, I didn't plan it this way. Although, you know, I do, as it happens, our eldest son and his wife and 15-month-old baby live in New Jersey. And now, you know, they just had their power knocked out. But in March, when we went down to visit, you know, they took us to the Jersey Shore, and specifically to the community of Seaside. And so it's really kind of sobering, because we that particular day, we ate dinner in a restaurant. And you know, that restaurant had the roof taken off and was destroyed. Probably right over where we were eating, and then various houses that we saw along the boardwalk were swept in, and so it will never look the same. So it's kind of a sobering thought. However, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is not so much domestic disasters, but international disasters and international disasters in the context of politics. Just getting started, haven't missed anything. It's an absolutely huge topic to look at international disasters, and you know, in a way, I didn't realize that when I first undertook the book. The Polity Press in the UK actually approached me and commissioned the book. And I think they did so because well, my first book, which is about to go into a third edition, Environmental Sociology, has been a bestseller internationally. So I think that they thought it'd be interesting to see what point of view an environmental sociologist would have on disasters, because obviously the two of them are quite closely linked. What the Polity Press didn't know was that in fact, when I was a PhD student, I was a research associate at the Disaster Research Center, which at that time was at Ohio State and since moved to University of Delaware. And in fact, did field work on disasters, and so certainly have had firsthand experience with it. As I said, that it covers, if you look at the topic, it covers international development, it covers humanitarian concerns, it covers environmental. It's an absolutely huge topic, and I certainly wouldn't do it justice to try to talk about it all tonight. But what I am going to do tonight is I'm going to try to custom shape my talk to issues having to do with security, the military, you know, the kind of things I think your group probably are especially interested in. So that's where I'm going to start with a military issue. And I was came across an item that somebody had sent me this week from something called the Tech News Daily. Not really acquainted with that, but I think they picked it up from somewhere else. And anyways, according to this item in the Tech News Daily, something called the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Anybody know that one? I mean, I hadn't heard of that. It's
DARPA?
Yeah. That's a good.
It's been going for since the 80s.
Yeah.
It's the origin of the internet.
Mhm.
DARPA is the
DARPA,
source of the internet.
yeah, that's its acronym. It's a research agency in Hannigan. And they just launched something called the Robotics Challenge. And it's a contest to build all kinds of robots. And you know, one of the things that they've included in this contest is something called a disaster-ready robot, which they say would be useful for situations such as that following the Japanese tsunami. I guess it can go in where humans can't, right? And as they say, it's to create robots that can work alongside humans in disaster scenarios. Well, you know, Canadians who witness dramatic scenes of devastation and suffering after foreign disasters are probably unlikely to be asked to donate $10 or $20 or whatever to pay for robots in these kind of situations. But the DARPA contest does point to something that is more serious, I think, and an emerging trend. And that is the privatization and securitization of the international politics of natural disaster. Walden Bello, whom you may have heard of, he's a Filipino sociologist, activist, founding director of a group called Focus on the Global South. He's based in the Research Institute in Bangkok, Thailand. He's written about what he calls a new RRC, or Relief and Reconstruction Establishment, that has as its central players the U.S. military and political command, the World Bank, some of the larger NGOs, and this, as I'm quoting, is composed of a volatile mixture of strategic concerns, bureaucratic imperatives, profit-making, and partisan humanitarianism. Well, I mean, this sounds a lot like the military-industrial complex from the 1950s and 1960s. Now, I'm a little bit reluctant to proclaim that this is the new military-industrial complex, although Naomi Klein would probably agree with that, and you know, when she's writing about shock capitalism and everything. But nonetheless, you know, in the course of researching this book, I came across a lot of material that I found disturbing, and a lot of it has to do with a change in the nature of disaster politics and disaster management. And increasingly, it's becoming militarized. It's becoming oriented to something I call insurance logic rather than humanitarian logic. And in fact, Bello didn't mention it, but one of the big players in this complex are the large reinsurance companies. Swiss Re, Munich Re, they're absolutely huge, and they have their finger in a lot of these things and have for a long time. So too, the big IFOs, international finance organizations, the World Bank and all their various regional equivalents. So there's certainly, you know, this is the concluding chapter of the book, and let me just read you what I wrote in the conclusion to the book. So what is more likely to happen, you know, rather than a full-scale military-industrial complex equivalent, is that projects that provide quantifiable estimates or models of risk and or mitigation measures for catastrophic scale hazards will increasingly be privileged over those that do not. Hard data will crowd out soft data. Privatized security and disaster response services will continue to flourish. Insurance logic will replace humanitarian concern. Resilience will trump transformation. The language of disaster management will shift with phrases like accountability, era of results, measurable outcomes, economic viability, cost efficiency, return on disaster risk investments, disaster proofing, and willingness to pay. these are going to be the guiding phrases. At least remote sensing will almost certainly become a standard tool in natural hazard monitoring and risk assessment, possibly in tandem with geospatial intelligence and support of national security. Now, I'll come back to this nearer to the end of the talk and look at each of these and give you some examples of this. But certainly this is one of the messages of the book itself, and that is that we're moving towards a new paradigm. And I don't think that's very well known. Yet there's a lot of things about this new paradigm that certainly are unsettling. Okay, before I come back to this though, I want to tell you about what I call three narratives or storylines, which run through, crisscross through the recent history of the international politics of natural disasters. And I think you'll see as we go how these are relevant to what I just said. Moving along. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, so three storylines. The first of these I've entitled Disaster Aid versus Disaster Reduction. And for most of us, the notion of coping with disaster means providing disaster aid or disaster relief, both during the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, flood, hurricane, whatever, or in the months afterwards. And it's interesting, this was Now Magazine listed this event as one of their 3 events to see tonight. And this is their little write-up said, every major calamity generates the same questions. What happens to the aid money? And what social forces lose out in the reconstruction? Well, good questions. But, I think what they certainly indicate is that the focus in the media, as well as in the public at large, is on disaster relief, disaster aid. And mass media, of course, play a central role here. They convey horrific scenes of destruction. They convey appeals from NGOs, such as Oxfam, Save the Children, World Vision. By the way, do you know which of those groups pulls in most money? Yeah. I came across a figure, and evidently all of the other big NGOs, humanitarian NGOs, have banded together, and instead of competing, they're doing common appeals. The only 2 exceptions are the Red Cross and World Vision Canada. And evidently, at least during the 2011 famine in East Africa, public contributions to World Vision Canada were equal to those of all of the rest of the members of the Humanitarian Coalition. Well, their appeals, as you know, are for aid money. But in the 1980s, another way of helping in international disasters emerged, and this is called disaster risk reduction, or DRR. And this approach differs considerably from the humanitarian intervention model that still predominates in disaster planning and relief circles. And put simply, DRR advocates and practitioners argue that disaster aid is both a bottomless pit and a Band-Aid solution. And of course, the reason for this is that you hundreds of millions of dollars into providing relief, and then 5 years later, it happens again. And so I mean, obviously, a more effective solution is to undertake measures that will prevent or at least reduce the impact of disasters in the first place. I mean, it seems to make a lot of sense. What they call anticipatory measures. These can range all the way from physical measures such as earthquake-proofing buildings, all the way down to social measures such as combating poverty. And in fact, one of the most effective set of disaster reduction measures that you can undertake are those to protect an ecosystem of coastal swamps, tidal marshes, mangrove forests. Mangrove forests are particularly important for a whole range of reasons. Among other things, they certainly buffer the effect of things like tidal waves, but they also have all kinds of amazing contributions to local economies of people in Vietnam and places like that. But of course, these are the very things that are rapidly disappearing. And you know why they're disappearing. They're disappearing because international hotel chains want to build hotels right on the water. People expect that if they book one of these holidays, then and this is what happened in Thailand in 2004. They had all these hotels that were built right on the water, and when the tidal wave moved in, they were the first impact. But there's all kinds of other things that are going on too. Aquaculture, fish farms. In Vietnam, what's happening is they're draining the mangrove forests, mangrove swamps, and they're building fish farms. And in fact, they're getting money for this from development agencies and the World Bank and people like this that see it as lifting the economies of nations in South Asia. But the problem is that it may lift the overall economy, but for local people it's devastating because in a whole range of different reasons that they depend on these mangrove swamps for all kinds of things. So, this is both the opportunity and the problem, and that is that there are all kinds of things that you can do to greatly mitigate the effect of disasters. But a number of these things that you can do fly in the face of tourist development, other forms of economic development. And of course, who's funding so much of what goes on in the global south? But not just the World Bank, but all kinds of other agencies who in essence, are interested in development, not in protecting against disasters. The case for a new disaster risk reduction approach was first proposed in the 1980s And it was actually proposed by a couple of leading earthquake engineers in the US. And they managed to sell the idea to their association, earthquake engineering organization, and in particular, they proposed something started in 1990 called the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. The problem they had is that they couldn't get the word out. They couldn't basically get it off the ground. So what they ended up doing was approaching the United Nations. And the United Nations agreed. And so the United Nations took over the initiative. And it was proclaimed in 1999. It was kind of a mixed blessing. It certainly got the word out, but as you know, the United Nations is hopelessly paralyzed with internal politics and bureaucracy, and certainly since then there have been all kinds of activity that look very good up there, including a couple of world conferences in Japan in '94, 2005, creation of still around the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. Looks great, but the problem is that these United Nations initiatives in DRR have been hopelessly underfunded. And basically, there are a few nations that have been very good in terms of supporting this. Japan, and for obvious reasons, I guess. Mexico, Philippines. But generally speaking, the nations of the world have not really wanted to spring sufficient money for these United Nations agencies to do much. I think part of it is that they don't want to cede power to a global organization. But they want to keep that themselves. And this goes way back. I mean, the first of these, that was proposed back in the 1930s under the League of Nations. There was an Italian guy who'd been the president of the Italian Red Cross, who founded an organization, and one of the central planks in that was to have a global disaster insurance scheme, except that it was undercut partially by one of the big German insurance magnates, partially by the British government itself, who again didn't want to give up any kind of autonomy or money to nations that had more disasters than the UK did. So it's been going on for a long time.
Can you make any comments about the Canadian aid policies? Because I was part of a group that wrote a grant to CETA after the floods and the earthquake in Pakistan in 2008. And one of the I remember how the funding was allocated, and most of it was for disaster aid, but there's a fair bit also for empowering women, trying to get the local trade going and stuff.
Okay, I'll get to that as I go
Yeah.
on. Now, what we're talking about here is, funding, basically coming from the big superpowers. Now, having said that, Canada generally tends to be one of the more enlightened countries in terms of funding. There are a few countries that the UK I think because in Britain they have a very strong development focus in the UK, so that Britain's been more forward-looking in terms of funding, but the United States in particular, given its size and power, and that has been very skimpy in terms of the money that they've put forward. China hasn't been part of the disaster scene until relatively recently. China basically shunned the international scene until very recently. So what it means is the lion's share of money continues to flow to disaster aid, not disaster reduction. And in a lot of cases, you can't legally move money that's been donated to a particular country for disaster aid and move it to disaster reduction projects. So it means that while disaster risk reduction has been embraced by many key humanitarian and development agencies. The Red Cross, Red Crescent has a separate unit in it to deal with disaster risk reduction. Oxfam has been a leader in it. So big NGOs have certainly awakened to this. But the problem is that the funding for these kind of preventive activities is just a drop in the bucket compared to the money that flows into disaster aid and relief. And in fact, one of the problems of disaster aid and relief is that often they have surpluses. So much money flows in, and so many NGOs, 300, 500 NGOs all go in after a disaster, and there's so much money around that they don't know what to do with it. They literally don't know what to do with it. So they have surpluses sitting there for disaster aid at the same time as disaster reduction is hurting. So that's one of the disparities. Let me just go back. Disaster risk reduction I've described as a discourse. In the sense that these other areas of discourse engage and overlap with it, but remain separate. And there are four of these. Humanitarian aid, international development, environmentalism and climate change, and finally it's called hazard, risk, and safety, which tends to be more meteorology, earthquake engineering, and things like this. So they basically all engage with one another in terms of disaster risk reduction, but on the other hand, they're not subsumed by it, and they're much larger. I mean, international development, humanitarian aid, of course, are huge compared to number of people doing disaster risk reduction. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about, following from this, is one of these overlaps. And this is disaster risk reduction and environmentalism and climate change, and specifically climate change. And if disaster risk reduction is underfunded, what they call climate change adaptation is swimming in money. And this wasn't always the case. Initially, you had what was called a dual policy path. That is, when it came to climate change, you had climate change mitigation, which means reducing greenhouse gases, and you had climate change adaptation, which meant somehow adjusting to the changes that are brought about by global climate change. Initially, mitigation had the upper hand, and in fact, climate change adaptation was looked down upon and struggled because basically engaging in adaptation was seen as a as admitting that those that were trying to control carbon emissions and things like that had failed. And it was a kind of like throwing in the towel. So the climate mitigation people really saw adaptation as a junior partner. But of course, what happened is that with the collapse of negotiations in Copenhagen, and I mean, basically climate change mitigation, and in its various forms, whether it be carbon trading schemes or carbon taxes or things like that, are clearly have entered rough waters and are struggling. And once this started to happen, then in a sense the compass has changed direction. And now climate change adaptation is the flavor of the day. And so funding is following that. So those engaged in climate change adaptation are quite well funded. One of the reasons I know this, I joined one of these LinkedIn discussion groups of climate adaptation types or whatever. And believe me, there's thousands of them all over the world, and they all got well-funded programs up and running. The question, though, is that they got the money, but what do they do? They literally don't know what to do. People who know what to do are practitioners that are working in disaster risk reduction. That is because they've been on the ground in villages and rural areas and in communities, particularly in various parts of the global south. And they've been doing this for a long time. They've been doing it since the 1980s. So basically, they know what to do. They don't have the money, and the climate adaptation practitioners have the money, but they don't know what to do. Now, it would seem to be a marriage made in heaven, except that they share certain assumptions, but in some ways they differ quite a bit. One way they differ is in terms of, climate adaptation is top down. Disaster risk reduction is bottom up. Disaster risk reduction basically gets their knowledge from indigenous people and that they work with. Climate adaptation people come in and they have these directives from reports that are written at the IFCC and things like that, which they want to impose. In addition, there's a time factor. Climate adaptation is looking at long-term scenarios. Disaster risk reduction is looking at the monsoon that's happening this year. One of the problems that's emerged, and this is a very complicated situation, but one of the problems that emerges is that disaster risk reduction people can't get money for the cope with monsoon flooding and things like that. Because unless they can decisively establish a case that this is due to global warming. And of course, a lot of what happens, it's been happening for a long time. And for the people involved, it's no less traumatic. If you get flooded out in a village and lose your livelihood, it doesn't much matter, if that's a normal disaster or something that might have some kind of long-term connection to global warming. So there are certainly some problems with these two groups. Now, as we'll see, back to the new military-industrial complex, or version of it. A number of the players in that are very, very interested in climate change. Some might say they're even obsessed with climate change. The big insurance companies, well, you can see why. I mean, look at the losses with Hurricane Sandy to the insurance companies. And it's going to be really going to depress their bottom line to have to pay out. And you know, Sandy is not even the largest hurricane by loss in American history. It's, I don't think it's even in the top 10, or at least with, you know, the initial $20 billion estimate didn't even put it in the top 10. So the big insurance companies are very, very worried indeed about what could happen with some of these scenarios of global climate change. So are the big banks, the World Bank and others. And in fact, so are national governments. And I'll get to this a little bit later on. National governments who generally have stood back from participating in any significant way over the years are suddenly paying attention. Why are they paying attention? Well, there are certain reasons having to do with security and other things that make them quite worried about climate change. Okay, the third thing, third storyline I want to look at is, go back to it, the blurring of humanitarian response and military involvement. Now, I think you probably know this story. A number of you know this story because it's been going on for a long time. And it goes back to the 1970s and 1980s. And it goes back to places like Biafra, the Ethiopian famine in the mid-1980s. And this is the time when the boundaries between humanitarian agencies and national states began to blur. You know, up until that time, you know, at least in theory, humanitarian agencies tended to like to think that they were neutral, and that they weren't engaged politically. Of course, this was never the case, but certainly, you know, this was what they thought. You know, I came across an obituary on Wednesday in the Globe and Mail. Some of you may have seen it. Legendary UN figure held for service. A gentleman named Newton Bowles, who you know, basically you know, ran UNICEF for a long time. It's cousin of Lester Pearson, by the way. Remember, some of you know Lester Bowles Pearson. He was kind of a patrician figure, but you know, he ran all kinds of things. And you know, he's quoted in here, marvelous story. He's talking about being in Shanghai during the Chinese Civil War, and you know, how he somehow managed to get aid. You know, I think to the communist side by somehow managing to import 6 members of Mao's people and bring them to Shanghai to a hotel and somehow negotiate with them. But the notion here was that aid agencies didn't take sides, they were neutral, and you know, therefore that they basically were untouched by all of the skullduggery that went on. But of course, this broke down in the 70s and the 80s. You know, it broke down when you began to get various rebel warlords and you know, parts of countries that broke off, and you know, then these people played hardball. And they basically said, if you don't come in under our terms, we won't let you in. And that caused a huge split in the humanitarian movement, where the Red Cross withdrew. And I think it was in Biafra they withdrew, and they were seriously criticized for this, and ultimately it's what gave rise to more militant humanitarian groups, notably Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders arose in the wake of Biafra when the Red Cross would go in. But the problem is that the humanitarian groups started to get drawn into these situations. And so what would happen is that national states would withdraw from a situation, but they would designate humanitarian agencies, you know, as their negotiators, or as their brokers. So, you know, if you had a rebel chief in somewhere in East Africa, and a rebel chief would negotiate with the nations of the world through the humanitarian agencies. Well, this is very dangerous, of course, and in fact, what's happened is corrupted a number of these agencies have lost their virginity. And of course, you know, some disaster analysts have detected a new species of neoliberal politics, wherein the strategic delivery of state and international aid became integrated with humanitarianism under the title or the rubric of ethical or moral foreign policy. And in defense circles, humanitarianism is increasingly described as soft weaponry, or just another tool in reconstruction and democracy building operations. And so this has given rise to what's been called the muscular or militant humanitarianism. This is spilled over from you know, delivering aid in civil wars and famines and things like that. It's spilled over into more mainstream disaster, natural disaster aid and delivery. And I think the point where this really began to happen was in 2004, after the Indian Ocean tsunami. And the U.S., although it's not alone, Australia was also engaged in this, moved in very aggressively into Indonesia and tried to manipulate the situation in order to enhance their particular standing in that part of the world. There's a marvelous example of this that I came across, which actually has to do with the U.S. and what the U.S. decided their contribution was going to be after the Indian Ocean tsunami, at least their contribution in Indonesia. And they decided that what they were going to do was they were going to build a superhighway. And you know, so they imported some of their guys who knew how to build highways, And of course, the coastal highway had been washed out, of course, and they were going to rebuild it. The problem they ran into is they decided to use the same kind of techniques that they would use in a North American community. So, what did they do? Well, among other things, when they got tired of negotiating with the villagers, then they tried to, basically take over their land for the highway. In the same way as in North America, of course, if you want to build a project and people get in the way, then basically it's in the public interest to grab that land. So that's what they tried to do in this case. Needless to say, it didn't go over very well. And then there's, I just want to read you a little bit about this road. One of the things that they didn't take into consideration with this road is that with the original coastal road, there are all kinds of local businesses that flourished along the road. Because what would happen is people would come along, albeit relatively slowly, and they'd stop and they'd buy some fruit and food and things like that, and then move along. And so there were whole economies that were along this road. The Americans said, build a superhighway, so nobody has to stop. Well, I mean, as you can guess, by doing so, it's yet another example. I mean, just like the mangrove swamps and the destruction of local businesses in Vietnam and that, of basically, and it's not meant as a pun, bulldozing your way through. So the Americans started to play hardball. At one point, they even threatened to remove funding unless it was done their way. As I said, they threatened to oppose eminent domain, which is the concept that describes these land grabs. They were sending in the police to try to mediate disputes, in a heavy-handed sort of way. And certainly, by the time, 7 years later, 2011, at least when I wrote this, the project was still only part way happening. Well, this isn't unique. This is the kind of military response. And as I say, the United States isn't alone. Australia has also been engaging in this kind of activity. And I think you can see the segue from this into what I was saying at the beginning. And that is that the more disaster response revolves around securitization, militarization, politicization, privatization, and these type of things, the more it changes the conversation, the more it changes or threatens to change the way things are done. And I guess I'm coming relatively to the end, so let me just wrap it up by giving you a few examples of this. One of the more influential writers on international affairs today, who seems to turn out a book every year, is Robert Kaplan. He's got a new book out about maps and their importance in the world. But his one before that was called The Indian Ocean and the Future of American Power. And of course, Robert Kaplan is plugged into the various defense establishment kind of agencies in Washington. He's a fellow at something called the Center for New American Security, Washington think tank, as it's described. And in his book, The Indian Ocean, the Future of American Power, his thesis is that the geopolitical focus in the world will shift away from the Western Hemisphere to monsoon Asia. India, Pakistan, China, Indonesia, Burma, Oman, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Tanzania. And this represents a kind of strategic realignment in the post-war era. And he says one area where all this will particularly play out is in the politics of natural disasters. And he points to Bangladesh in particular. He says that Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable to serious flooding, and that the U.S. Defense, in particular the U.S. Navy, is particularly nervous about what could happen in Bangladesh and some of these other countries in terms of upsetting the status quo. And of course, it's becoming a volatile region. We've all read about the Chinese going to the brink of armed conflict with the Japanese, over some islands in some South China Sea. So this is a volatile region, and natural disasters play a role in this, and this draws the military in further. Another thing that's happening, remember I said at the beginning, I was talking about remote sensing. Well, this is becoming a huge thing now. Is remote sensing from satellites. And on the surface it looks benign, right? Surely it can be useful to have satellites sending back pictures of what areas appear to be flooded and which aren't, and it can help response, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The only problem is there's a close relationship between the companies, and a lot of this has been privatized, the companies that are engaging in remote satellite sensing and military uses. So for example, one of the companies that's deeply engaged in this, one of the other activities recently was taking the satellite pictures that allowed the US military to go in and grab bin Laden. They were acting on the basis of satellite photos. So you have the same agency that's supplying bin Laden photos is surveying flooded areas. Now, where is this going to lead? I don't know. But certainly it's disturbing. And in fact, there's a whole new industry that are involved in all of these high-tech risk modeling, catastrophic risk modeling, remote sensing. With catastrophic risk, there are three major agencies. All of them that seem to have acronyms: AIR, AIR, EQUICAT, and RMS. RMS sounding risk management solutions. And they're getting big contracts, and they're engaging in the kind of catastrophic risk modeling that's very reminiscent of what happened during the Cold War. If you remember back the writing of Herman Kahn and other people that were writing during the threat of the nuclear. Basically, I mean, this is they even use the same kind of language. I thought this was interesting. One of these firms borrowed some advice from none other than Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld once said, there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. So every time an event happens, the more known knowns, the more we learn. Kind of worries me that they're looking as their touchstone to Donald Rumsfeld. In addition to that, there are other trends that are going on I won't talk about to the same extent. But one of them I've mentioned twice is privatization. One of the things that's happening is that the big insurance companies are offering policies now, largely in North America, but no doubt they'll roll them out, which means that in case of case your home is caught up in a disaster, you will get personal service, private service. So, for example, there are cases, I think it was out in California or whatever, when the forest fires moved in, and you know, probably saw that on TV where all the homes are burning on the hills and that. Except that there are a couple that were saved. And why are they saved? Because the homeowners had policies, and the company sent in private firefighters. And I mean, this is increasingly a number of these functions are shifting from being in the public sphere to being in the private sphere. And the final I call this the SCPQ configuration: securitization, catastrophic scenario building and risk modeling, privatization, and quantification. What quantification means, and there was one reference to it earlier in the talk, is that increasingly the value of things is being judged in numbers. Now, in and of itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing. One of the reasons it's come about is there's a feeling that a lot of aid money has gone down the drain, it's being wasted, or it's being drained off by corrupt regimes and things like that. And so they're going to move to ways of measuring these things using hard numbers. In a way, what it's similar to is what's happened in the advertising business. Where clients in recent years have said, show us that our ads are increasing business. Or the same thing's happening in philanthropy, where those who are giving money are saying, I want to see where my money is going. Well, the same thing's happening in the aid sector. That in and of itself isn't bad. But there's a downside to it. And one of the downsides is that those activities that are amenable to quantification are, of course, for example, those that are connected to disaster aid. You can measure how many medical kits are sent to Haiti. But you can't measure, or it's much more difficult to measure the impact of disaster risk reduction, because that's not as quantifiable, and it's more long term. So there's some evidence of what's happening is that those agencies that can't produce quantifiables are being defunded. And in fact, that's what happened. With the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, the UN agency, it depended for about 25% of its funds on the UK government. UK government engaged in an exercise where they did an assessment. They scored each of the 100-something agencies that they funded, and this agency came second last in funding. Well, I mean, there's some good reasons. It's not exactly been the most effective agency in the world. But as one commentator in the Humanitarian press said, one of the reasons why they basically scored so low is that they're an organization that engages in planning and coordination. And therefore, how can you come up with quantifiables? And I mean, this is being certainly driven by the World Bank. The World Bank is everywhere in terms of economic and financial models and things like that. And who's using them? Well, in the humanitarian community, there are those in some of the big humanitarian and development agencies and that are basically using tools which are delivered to them by the World Bank and others, and involve highly quantifiable use of economic indicators and things like that. Again, the problem with using macroeconomic indicators and that is that it might help the gross national product of Vietnam, but individual villagers are going to be ruined as a result of policies that attack the macro and ignore the micro. So anyways, what I argued in the book is that when you bring together these trends towards securitization, scenario building, risk modeling, privatization, quantification, it's going to change the culture. Not just the culture of a humanitarian relief, but it's going to change the culture of disaster management and disaster planning and things like that. And if they impose a very quantifiable, what I call insurance risk upon that, then it's going to be a very different world. Okay, thank you.
We'll have questions and answers in a moment. I just want to say one thing. So some of you came in late, I wanted to delay it until now. After 9 o'clock, when we'll leave here, John Hannigan and I and some others will go over to the Duke of York pub for supper. So those of you who are interested in continuing the conversation and want to buy your supper can join us. We can talk about it later. I've reserved for 10 people, so we'll see how many people want to go. Okay, John, you want to field your own questions here?
Sure.
Do you think there might be a change in with the World Bank policies with Jim Kim as the president?
Well, I know when he accepted the job. I know what he said. And in fact, I downloaded his statement upon accepting. And in fact, I want to use this. My next book is about oceans, by the way, and so I wanted to use it in connection with that. All I can say is that I'll believe it when I see it. There have been a lot of very well-intentioned, honorable people over the years at various agencies like that, and they have to be a very strong and unique person to resist the culture of the organization. And so I mean, we'll see. He's very new at the job, but and I'm not saying he's not sincere. I'm sure he's quite sincere about what he said. But is he going to be able to turn the ship? Well, we'll see.
Thank you very much. Towards the end of your talk, you referred to Herman Kahn, who wrote a very famous book called Thinking About the Unthinkable.
Yeah.
I wonder if you would be kind enough to comment a little bit. It occurs to me that public consciousness needs to be made aware of so many of these things. And it is not at all an unlikely possibility nowadays that we can have not only the terrible wars that are raging at the present time, and often across borders, and as well as within borders, but there is distinctly the possibility that things would get out of control and that the world would be an area of devastation. So I wondered if you'd like to comment on that a little bit. I know that I've been in touch somewhat with the Earth Institute at the United Nations, which is urging us to be aware of needs all over the place. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that a little bit, because it seems to me there's a great gap generally in public consciousness about this really doomsday scenario. I mean, we already had many doomsday scenarios,
Mhm.
but that perhaps is the ultimate one. I wondered if you'd like to comment on that a little bit. Sure.
Well, one of the areas, my areas in sociology is in fact social movements. And, you know, I mean, one of the topics within social movements is how are social movements, how can they be effective or not? You know, what is the best method, the most effective method of exercising your power as a social movement? There's a paper that just came out, I think it was in one of the American Sociological Review or one of them, where somebody looked at the environmental area and you know, wanted to see what was the most effective thing you could do within the environmental area, you know, with regards to corporations and that to change their behavior. Most effective thing actually was to basically become stockholders, show up at their annual meetings, create a ruckus, you know, basically to exert power from within the organizations itself. Much less effective, and they looked at a long, big data set, much less effective were those that were on the outside, you know, those that are marching around in front of the corporation with picket signs and things like that. Didn't do any good. You know, basically the corporations could care less about that, but what they did were more likely to react to those that carried out their protest within the corporations themselves. Now, in terms of the, you know, if we go back to the era that you're talking about, I guess there were two big social movements that were happening back in those days. One of them, of course, was the civil rights movement, yeah, which ultimately was successful. And you know, there's been many books and articles and everything written about why is the civil rights movement so successful. One of the answers ultimately ended up saying that it was the contribution of the black churches in the U.S. that provided all kinds of resources and moral support and things like that. It had less to do with Mrs. Leonard Bernstein embracing the cause and, you know, the liberals, the elite liberals and things like that. But it had a lot to do with the muscle that the black churches brought out. The other one, of course, was the marches, particularly in Britain, you know, against nuclear, atomic or nuclear. You know, I think in that particular case, I mean, they were so large and you know, basically such a high profile and everything like that that they couldn't be ignored. But I think in terms of what we're looking at now, you know, it's hard to know where is an effective pressure point in terms of this. And one of the problems, of course, is that most people don't even know what's going on. You know, it's, and particularly amongst the many of those in the younger generation. You know, I was kind of surprised this week. I asked I teach a class in collective behavior, and I wanted to illustrate something, so I asked them how many had seen the movie Argo. You know, which of course is about the storming of the Iranian embassy back in the Jimmy Carter era, and bringing out the 6 American hostages that were being sheltered in the embassy and that. That was *1, by the way, in the North American box office last week. Not a single one of my students had seen it. A few of them vaguely knew what it was about. So, I mean, it's an uphill battle, you know, you know, I guess it depends on what model of social change you think is effective or what isn't. Bill?
John, I think I'm not the only one who's been seeing a lot of ads lately in the media focusing around the well-worn set of boots that a man and probably other men and women have been using to bring, through UNICEF, to bring items to needy children around the world. And the significance of the boots is that these people have walked nearly around the world. No place is too far.
Right.
And I wonder, this is a two-pronged question, what they could be bringing, such as, for example, preventive medicines, as compared to clothing or toys or what have you. That would be a more positive contribution toward prevention, as you've been putting it. And the other thing is that you mentioned at the beginning world vision. My impression is that that's church related. Very much I think the evangelical churches.
That's right. Yeah.
And I just wonder to what extent, like the guy with the boots, they could be doing something that's positively preventive rather than just showing succor to the underprivileged.
Well, talk about boots. Here they are.
Oh, okay.
This is in the Toronto Star today. So to know a man, you have to walk in his boots. After decades of relief work, activist receives fitting honor. This is some of you might know him, a gentleman named Nigel Fisher. Evidently they've taken Nigel's boots that have traipsed around the world, and they're putting them on display in the shoe museum, the Beta Shoe Museum. But he couldn't be there because he's in Haiti, because Haiti got hit by the hurricane Sandy as well. So he's in his office in Haiti working to do these things. Well, I think there's one lesson from this, though, and it's a great visual, right? And if you're going to communicate your message, then we live in a visual age, and so I think the boots are a great visual. In terms of your second question, there are lots of really effective things that can be done. I think there's one that's been in place for a long time, and that has the clean water. Tremendously important type of thing to do. The kind of thing that Bill Gates and Bill Clinton and that are doing, I think are tremendously important. But like everything else, nothing's immune from politics. When it comes down to it, it's not always the most effective measures that are undertaken that are the ones that are most popular, the ones that attract the donor money. As you well know, in the aid industry, and it is an industry, the real breakthrough came when there's the realization that people will give more money if they can connect it to one person rather than just give money generally. That's what led to giving aid, and you get you basically adopt a kid in Africa, and the kid sends a letter back to you, and it personalizes it, and et cetera, et cetera. But of course, the kind of aid money that is deployed in these situations, this may not be the best use of it. But you're on a kind of a treadmill, right? To get off the treadmill would mean that these agencies might reduce their contributions a lot, right? So they have to somehow balance fiscal matters and effectiveness.
I think your lecture explained very nicely why it's difficult for poor countries, Bangladesh being an example you gave, to get adequate disaster risk reduction. But it doesn't at all explain why a rich country such as the United States can go on and on having disaster after disaster with colossal damage each time. It seems to me there's been a lack of engineering or something at home which allows these disasters to go on one after another, year after year. And the hurricanes and the twisters I'm thinking of as two examples of which give local disasters or coastal disasters and so on. What do you see as being the remedy there? What needs to take place there?
Well, one of the first papers I ever wrote, back when I was at the Disaster Research Center, was on what we call disaster subcultures. And really the problem that we were looking at, and we were, at that time, had just done a study of flooding in Winnipeg, in southern Manitoba. And so what we were looking at is that why do people stay in locations that flood or are subject to hurricanes or tornadoes year after year?
Right.
You know, why don't they move?
Yeah, I had Winnipeg in mind when I asked my question
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, and I mean, the answer is that people say it's home, and we're not going to be defeated by nature. We're going to rebuild. We're going to fight back. I mean, you look at after every event like this, and at least on the media, and they always have somebody in front of the camera saying we're going to.
But in your work, do you consider they fight back intelligently or stupidly?
If the press was here, I'd give you a different answer. Let's put it this way: if I lived there, I'd move. But you know, where this really, where this became a huge issue was in New Orleans, right? Because after Katrina, and that. I mean, the areas that were wiped out were the low-lying areas. The low-lying areas were the poor Afro-American areas. From an engineering point of view, you could say with some confidence, nobody should ever live there again. That your odds of it happening again are too high. But when they tried to bring this solution forward, all hell broke loose, right? And it was seen. It was interpreted as racist against poor blacks. We came forward and said, we've been here since 1700s or whatever, and you're trying to displace us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact of the matter is they didn't move them. Slowly rebuilding down there. They've been lucky so far, but it's just a matter of time. But I mean, this is politics, right? When it comes down to the politics of New Orleans. And I'm not defending the authorities, because obviously in New Orleans, what they would love to do is to erase these areas and turn New Orleans into a theme park.
Surely there must be a federal element there, because who paid for everything last time? Who paid? Did the federal government pay?
Well, I mean, they certainly had some FEMA money, some insurance company money. Do you know who? Strangely enough, who the most effective force after Katrina was? Does anybody know who?
Motor guy, right?
Huh?
Motor guy, what's his name?
No, it was actually, and you're going to be blown away by this, Walmart. Because, Walmart has a lot of things not to like. Not the least of which is they destroy small town businesses. They have bad labor practices and stuff like that. But one thing Walmart has is they have all of these elaborate disaster response plans, right? And basically it was Walmart that was sending in the semi trucks with crates of water and all kinds of other things, where as you know, FEMA was bungling the whole thing. So in terms of the actual first response in that, strangely enough, it was Walmart.
You said a kind word in the beginning about Canadian aid politics. Have you followed up what's happening with CEDA? Is there still a kind word to be said? I mean, much has been defunded that CEDA used to do that was really quite good, such as the work of Kairos and other things. Have you followed up what's going on now?
Well, I had a colleague who's a geographer and quite plugged into the international development scene, who told me not too long ago that CEDA seems to be getting involved with people they shouldn't, notably mining firms.
Yep, that's
And that-
exactly what I thought.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, I don't know whether this is, we're seeing the influence of the Harper government, you know, on it. But, you know, stay tuned for CEDA, but I'm starting to wonder where they're headed.
Yeah, we may not want to say friendly words next time.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I'm from Bangladesh, and I'm going to just respond to some of the issues. First is, you see, when you talk about disaster risk management and reduction, the danger, and it's a false assumption, is that you can cover all risks. You know, it's like climate change. You cannot go on adapting indefinitely. So the problem that we have in the disaster risk reduction concept is that we are responding to the symptoms rather than treating the disease. You know, I think this is very important for everyone to understand, because you can't go on adapting indefinitely. If you look at global temperature rises, based on the best pledges that have been made in all the conference of parties, you're looking at close to 4 degrees Celsius, which is nowhere near the 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees. So in the future, what you're going to have is you're going to have more intense disasters, and the frequency is also going to go up. So Sandy is not a freak. You know, Sandy is going to repeat itself. And when you have global temperatures going up, when the oceans are warmer, when the sea level is going up, the storm surges are going to hit you that much harder. And that's why the US is totally behind, you know, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in the electricity, in the power distribution. So that requires a huge investment. Now, when we look at Bangladesh, you know, and I can talk from the experience of Bangladesh, disaster risk reduction has been a spectacular success in terms of saving lives. Look at a cyclone that would hit Bangladesh 10 years ago. A few 100,000 people would die. But now, because we have adopted prevention and resilience, so we try and differentiate. You look at pre-disasters and post-disasters. And you know, to us conceptually, as parliamentarians also, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. You have natural hazards which turn into disasters if you don't have the governance and the resources to respond to it. So how do you, in fact, reduce that risk? So if you go back to your circle, when you talked about the DRR discourse, what we would add in Bangladesh is governance as another circle, and the other would be sustainable development, because one single event can actually set you back 10, 15 years. And I was in Rio for the Rio Plus 20, something that they've done positive after a very long time, is that they've recognized disaster risk reduction as one of the fundamental pillars for sustainable development. And if we look to the future, if you look at the post-2015 development architecture, because the MDGs are running out, you had a reference to the Hyogo Declaration, the Hyogo Framework for Action. That is also going to run out in 2015. Climate change is going to be revisited in terms of what is going to be the temperature rise in aspirational terms. So 2015 is going to be a very, very important watershed year, because after 2015, you're not going to have all of these separate goals. You won't have the MDGs. You won't have the Hyogo Framework of Action. You will have a set of sustainable development goals, where DRR is going to feature very importantly. So at the moment, I agree with you, it is underfunded, but I think once it's mainstreamed into sustainable development, and it is taken up as part of the sustainable development goals, I think that scenario will change. The other aspect is, yes, climate change adaptation is funded more, but you see, if you look at your configuration there, the slide that we have on the board, privatization. It's not just in case of disasters. Everywhere we have this shift from public funds to creative capital, which is a euphemism for private finance. And I think the reason why that is happening is by virtue of default, because countries who committed to finance are not financing. So private finance is occupying that space, and it's happening by default. What makes life very difficult for a country like Bangladesh then is because private finance is not predictable. So how do you then go and plan 5 years, 10 years down the road? And I think this is something that is happening globally. So that's something that we really need to watch out for. And I think this is where the commitments that have been made by countries, because they're not following through. Even you look at climate change fast start finance. 10 billion was pledged a year for 3 years. So 30 billion, and out of that we have only had about 3 billion. So climate change adaptation is also underfunded. And I think what we are now looking at in Bangladesh is we are trying to look at it in terms of cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost of inaction and what is the benefit of action? If we invest $1 in risk resilience and reduction, we get a benefit of $5 to $6. Where do you build a school? Do you go and build it where you have a fault line, or do you build it somewhere else? Do you build the school with foundations that can withstand 20 or 30 miles per kilometer or per hour wind velocity? See, that's really the resilience, and I think that really has to be the future. So whether it's Canadian CEDA, whether it is international finance, you have to go to a mode of prevention and resilience, recognizing, of course, that you can't go on reducing risk indefinitely, because there will come a point when you simply cannot adapt. If Sandy hits US again in 6 months, no matter how strong and powerful that country and economy is, it is simply not going to be able to pick up time and again. So I think that's something that, from a policy perspective, and if you're talking about CEDA or others, that's really the focal, and that's the area which has to be given the maximum prominence and priority.
Thank you. My favorite example, by the way, of what you're saying near the end is, I think it's one of the Caribbean islands, Montserrat, I think it is, or whatever. And you know, they were some years ago they were wiped out by a hurricane, so they decided to rebuild. So they got all kinds of international funds, and they rebuilt. Where did they rebuild? They rebuilt at the base of the volcano. And then, well, you can guess what happened. It blew, and got wiped out again. I mean that's an extreme case, but I mean, you know, that's what happens when you don't do that kind of systematic analysis. Okay, let me just address some of the other things that you said. And by the way, Bangladesh has a reputation in the disaster community as one of the good guys. Bangladesh, you know, generally would be very well rated in terms of its response to disasters, particularly compared to some of the other countries in that part of the world. The problem with various declarations and other kinds of things is that they look good on paper, right? But they don't have any teeth. And you mentioned Hyogo, right? You know, this was a big disaster conference in Japan. Well, evidently what happened at Hyogo is that this is where they're going to present the Hyogo Declaration of all its different points, which include sustainable development and everything like that. Everybody's very excited about that. Well, then what happened, of course, is a tsunami rolled in, and evidently the major topic at Hyogo, particularly with regards to the mass media, had to do with warning systems, right? Had to do with tsunami warning systems, and so all the stuff about the points about the sustainable development, all that kind of stuff, just were pushed to the bottom, and these high-tech kinds of discussions about warning systems, things like that, rose to the fore. And that's the problem you find so often in this. You know, how do you actually implement these things? And one thing I didn't talk about, but I think it's really important, is that in all of the history of disaster politics, there have only been 2 binding multilateral agreements. One of them was in the 1930s and didn't work. The second one is relatively recent, but it's a minor thing that has to do with the use of communication satellites during disaster times. Other than that, we don't have a single binding multilateral agreement, right? And in the absence of that, then the nations of the world are not compelled legally, or comes down to it, as they often see it, morally, to act together. So I mean, you know, certainly a multilateral agreement is another thing that could give teeth to things like Hyogo and that. But you know, the politics intervenes, and these things get scuttled. Now, I hope you're right. I hope that in the future we'll see the real importance of disaster risk reduction. One of the problems over the years, of course, has been the relationship between local disaster providers in countries like Bangladesh and those that come in from the outside. And you know, there are some real problems in the past, you know, with these agencies that come in and think they know it all, right? And then they don't keep local people informed. So it's very poor communication, and often they don't have a really good sense of what's going on locally, and that type of thing. And you know, there have been reforms. I mean, there's things called clustering and the lead agencies and other kinds of things that they're undertaking to try to cope with that. So it happens different ways in different countries. In Pakistan, basically the generals operate the disaster response, and they ignore the agencies that are coming in. Generally, they probably do a better job than some of the foreign agencies that come in, but still, this isn't an optimal situation.
No, I think progress has been made. You know, I mean, there is more legislation, there are more protocols in place to allow people to come through, and I think ultimately the country has to build its own capacity. You know, you can't rely on. So in terms of assessing your needs, in terms of earmarking your priorities, as long as that is in place, then of course you can have that flow. And of course in Bangladesh, as in other countries, you have the other scenario where the military is really involved in aid of civil administration. So you know, the military doesn't take over. You mentioned about America and Australia trying to home in on Indonesia. In Bangladesh, we have had, you know, the Americans went in with Operation Sea Angels a few years ago. But I think the military is now increasingly seen as aiding civil administration, peace building, and I think that's a good thing because it keeps them away from politics. You know, give them a disaster responsibility, give them peacekeeping, and that's good because their stakes are so high that they would rather not burn those bridges.
I have a colleague, Mark Pelling. He's a geographer at King's College London, and one of the leading academic figures anyways in the disaster risk reduction movement. In fact, he endorsed the back of my books. And he's got an interesting argument. What he says is that all of what we've been talking about centers around this notion of resilience. Resilience meaning that you bounce back. But where do you bounce back to? You bounce back to where you were before. But in so many of these nations, where you were before involves horrible inequality. It involves elites, corrupt elites, exploiting local people, that kind of stuff. And so what he argues is that what you need is transformation. It's not enough to just bounce back and have resilience. What you need is to transform the society itself, you know, resilience is not going to be enough. So I think it's an interesting notion.
You were telling us about this whole changing paradigm from one of humanitarian concern or something like this. I wonder if it also occurred to you to imagine what this might evolve into somewhere down the road. If this is not something, well, you said this was a disturbing development. What would be a normative paradigm as you would imagine it?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think you're going to find total replacement. I don't think you're going to find humanitarianism and development and things like that are basically like lemmings going to go off the cliff and be totally replaced by this. You know, it's among other things, this humanitarian development communities are still huge. You know, and you're not going to just displace them.
So you mean the activity might oscillate between the two?
Yeah, well, I think you're going to see a period, right, in which I don't want to use the word coexist because it sounds benign, but certainly they're going to both be out there, right? And I mean, the question is one going to make inroads into the other? You know, you know, are the agencies and humanitarian development agencies and others going to push back on this, or are they going to get co-opted? And at this stage, I don't know what's going to. I mean, there's some evidence of both happening at the moment.
Yeah, you, in speaking about the military and disaster actions, you make it sound as if the humanitarian organizations have sort of caved in and are really now accepting being subordinate to political forces. And military, maybe the military forces. I remember having heard a very interesting conversation between James Orbinski, who was then the head of Doctors Without Borders, and Louis McKenzie, who was had been in charge of the peacekeeping operations in Sarajevo. And the dialogue was something like this. McKenzie said, I had to find some use for my forces, for my troops. So I gave them the job of protecting these humanitarian organizations. So as you moved around the city, we'd have a detail of jeeps that would go with you and protect you or so on. And Orbinski said, we don't want you anywhere near us. Please back off and stay away because you get us in trouble. And this is exactly what then became more common in Iraq, for example. The military would run up on the porch of a poor family and give them a box of groceries, showing what good guys the NATO forces were. And the next day, you know, the Doctors Without Borders people would, or some other humanitarian organization would come around there and get shot at because they were seen as too connected with each other. And the ones that I know of, the humanitarian organizations all want to really keep their distance from the military rather than, I think you made it sound as if they give it in to the rapprochement.
Well, you know, in the case of the U.S. government, it has various channels through which it delivers aid in disasters, right? And aid that's delivered directly by soldiers is a relatively small part of it. Most of it is delivered through USAID, you know, which is the official agency. And they even have operational units. They have something called DARTs. D-A-R-T is an acronym of you know, basically quick response teams that go in to disaster situations, things like that. But there's a lot of different ways that the U.S. becomes involved in these things, right? And not all of them involve troops going in, right? And now, thank God, the one thing I haven't come across is that I haven't seen any of these private security outfits, you know, in the U.S. Getting involved in this, although who knows.
To support Meta's point, I think there's an important distinction to be made about aid agencies going at the end of a disaster, so like a tsunami or something like that, but comparing that to an aid agency going in the midst of a war, civil war, or an ongoing conflict with the rebels and so on. And when in the second scenario, because the decisions that the aid agencies have to make are very difficult. On the one hand, they can't tolerate the atrocities that are happening, and at the same time, they have to negotiate with their local, power structure. So to be like Red Cross and say, I want to stay out of it, is something that, like, I know James Rubinsky personally, and it's something that they don't want to do. They don't want to stay back. So they feel compelled to go in, but at the same time they have to work in a political structure. So you can't separate, in my opinion, you can't separate politics from, this humanitarian space. It's always going to be there's always going to be tension in.
Absolutely. And the aid agencies themselves have been grappling with this. Doctors Without Borders had a schism. They broke into two. They had a part of their people that broke off, a more radical wing of Doctors Without Borders, and formed their own organization because they felt Doctors Without Borders was going the same direction as the Red Cross, and they weren't aggressive enough.
But I don't agree with your comment on how it's a militant aid agency, because they have to work in a military, in that tension. So how does that make them militant?
Well,
They don't. Presumably they don't take sides. They say that they just voice the atrocities that are happening on the ground.
well, they never used to take sides. That's true. But then some of the people began to criticize, and I mean, as you pointed out, began to criticize the Red Cross and others, saying that they were selling out, that they were moral weaklings because they weren't taking sides, and that if you have a strong moral conscience, means intervention. Right, and I mean that's one way that things have been going in humanitarianism. There is a tension. It's a good way of describing it. But part of this tension is between those that still want to keep to the kind of neutrality that dates all the way back to the founding of the Red Cross, and a newer point of view that says we can't live with ourselves. If we judge a situation and we see there's a good guy and a bad guy, and we don't take the side of the good guy.
Just a comment on the very concept of disaster nowadays historically, and the fact that your presentation reinforces to me that what exactly disasters are today, for whom, in a global context that we're going through, is not that disasters are becoming political issues or economic issues, but that disasters are already part of this agenda. And I just wanted to mention as leaving pieces of puzzles in there. One is Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
Haiti was absolutely exemplary, and in the fact that the aid from the United States was a military occupation, transforming a country that they had contributed, and all these developed nations had contributed to transform into a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And then they invaded the disaster to transform an island into a floating armed ship, and then guaranteed that the people that were victims of the disaster caused historically and aided by nature, in quotes, became actually completely suppressed, and the military behaved in such a way. And it was very interesting to see how the aid industry actually benefited and behaved through this. So that was one situation that Haiti, I think, is a lesson that must be looked into. The other one is, if you look at the United States Defense Forces, there's a document that was declassified recently, and it's from 2010, and it's about displacement and relocation. And there are actually, they don't define disaster, but they work on a definition of disaster that has already been developed elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that definition of disaster you can imply by reading their first paragraph, which states a planet that has 6 billion people in the very near future will have 9 billion people, and it will not be able to handle this population. Therefore, we need to train our armed forces to manage displaced and relocated people. And then the coordination of this is a military coordination based on an equation made by an establishment that is calculating the future based on lack of energy, lack of water, it's an increasing concentration of wealth and resources. To me, Haiti is the planet, and the military are another piece on this planning process. So what you've done is to reinforce that from different ends, disaster is no longer what we assume it to be. Something went wrong somewhere and some people need help. Today, disaster is something different. It's a fact of this transition from a world where that could be the assumption into one where very powerful players are moving their tools because they know what they're coming will not be enough for the amount of people the planet has. So they are already planning how to manage and handle the excess population, which is actually not excessive, but within the system there are too many for them to keep in hand. And Haiti to me was very visible for that. So and I thank you because you reinforced the fact that disaster is something else, and it may not be a disaster but an opportunity to those in power.
Right. Some excellent points. And I mean, first of all, if you know anything about the history of Haiti, you know that it's one series of time after another. I mean, every time the Haitians would get independent, a colonial power would come in and reoccupy them. You know, and so I mean, you can't understand Haiti without looking at its history, and its history is.
And if they keep going back after the disasters, they have nowhere else to go, and they fall for that.
Yeah.
It's not their stupid.
Yeah. You also, I think, make a really good point that disaster is a socially constructed term,
Yeah.
right? And who socially constructs things? Often those who have power, right? I mean, if you look at discussions of famine and drought, right? And I mean, there's reams and reams and reams that are written about that. You know, going back saying that they're not the same thing. You know, and you know that famines are not necessarily the result. Although drought plays a role in it, but there's a lot of other things involved in creating famines, and a number of those don't have anything to do with natural hazards per se. And even the very question of what it is. You know, I have my old advisor at Ohio State once wrote a book called "What is a Disaster?" Right, and it's a greatly debated, and even the notion of natural disaster. You know, I was reading something today where somebody said, if you look at Nepal, I think it is, and you know, it's increasing landslides in Nepal. Why is that happening? Deforestation. Is deforestation a natural effect, or is it a human made effect? And so do you define it as a disaster or what? So thank you. Some good points.
Margaret, you make it quick because we
Yeah.
have to be outlined.
Well, when we talk about military and disasters and see as the root cause climate change, then we also have to acknowledge that the military is the single largest contributor to climate change. And so if you want to mitigate, we need to look at the role of militaries, the military complex, as the real mitigation. And so I think at least we need to acknowledge that part.
And there's a lot more to it.
Yes.
I know from some of the research I'm doing into oceans that one of the so-called ticking time bombs under the deep oceans is all the military dumping for decades and decades and decades.
Submarines.
Well, I think we could go on all night. I mean, this sounds so interesting and so important.